Now, if you were alive in the 80s, you probably look back and remember some really, really exciting motorcycles. There was great motorcycle development going on at the time. Bikes were getting better every year, faster, smoother. Every possible thing about being a passionate motorcyclist came to fruition in the 80s, and I was lucky enough to have this GS. So adjust your device and you can watch this in full 4K. Well, it's supposed to be an absolutely beautiful day today. It's been cooler. We were hopefully over the really hot summer. And it's a good day to get out on the GS and get that wind blowing over your face with no windshield. And this is the bike to do it. One of my favorites, the GS1100E. Now what's funny is in the 80s, I worked for Ford Motor Company at the time, and I worked the midnight shift. So I basically had all day to work on motorcycles, go for rides, hang out with friends, and it's just so many good memories back of those days back in the 80s. Well, we're going to relive them a little bit today. We got to move a few motorcycles around. That's very typical of the way my life has evolved. Being retired now gives me a lot more time to do things that I had to rush through in the past. And getting the bike ready, getting it pre-flighted, checking the air in the tires, making sure everything is just the way it should be. I hate getting stranded on a road for something that I could take care of right in my own garage. And I've had two flat tires on the MT-09 that I guess I was just lucky. I caught them while I was doing this, checking the air in the tires. Now, it goes without saying, I had, back in the 80s, had an airplane, so I was very aware of pre-flighting things, making sure everything's the way I want it, that it's clean, that you have the right amount of fuel for the day. It just goes without saying. But feeding the fish and taking care of Karen's garden, I have always prioritized. And the way I always like to plan out my day with Karen is I always try to do all the work I can on a farm, water the plants, pick the tomatoes or whatever, and then I want to go out on the open road. So if I do this early in the morning, I get to go out while it's still a little cool, and today it actually was pretty cool. Now, the bikes came with a 15-tooth counter sprocket, but pretty much everybody I ever knew right away put a 14-tooth on so it would have a little bit better of a hole shot. And I went the opposite way with this. I have a 16-tooth, and it's overgeared, and because I have to ride that long ride on Route 80 out to the riding area every day. And in this time in the 80s, right around this time, I got interested in one thing. My friends used to all get together on Saturday morning and drive up to Lake George, to the area. We had a couple of friends that lived up in Big Indian in that area, and we would explore the back roads for the whole weekend. We got to stay at their house for free. Back in the day, that was a big attractive feature of it. And this bike just made those trips so much fun. And looking back to the 80s, that's probably one of the things I always remember the best. How much fun those long trips up to Lake George were. And I really can relate to people like Henry Hawk that go on 9,000-mile rides. I'm not doing any, and I never have done, any giant cross-country rides. But once you're out on the open road and the weather's sweet, and you got a bike that's got just a beautiful seat and beautiful power to pass people, it can be just a wonderful, wonderful experience. And we all hung out with my late friend Kenny Augustine. He had a speed shop up on 303. People would get together, and the talk of the day usually was about drag racing and who's going to go drag racing on Sunday and who's not, and who did this to the bike and who did that. And for all those years, I was tempted to modify this bike, and I am so glad, so glad I kept it stock. Now, my friend Paul is a drag racer, and he seems to comment on all of the videos I post, and positively. Thank you, Paul. But he's in professional real drag racing, and he said he had one of these that used to spin the tire, was highly modified, and spun the tire at 100 miles an hour. Well, not this one. And instead of spinning the tire at 100 miles an hour, I opted for longevity and maybe reasonable amounts of maintenance. These bikes really go 100,000 without any big deal at all. And I think the one Tim had went 130. And it's probably still going because it was running when he sold it. But anyway, and other people have had them. I don't know how many miles Dallas has on his. But all of the people that have these, the one thing, if you don't screw around with the motor too much, they just seem to outlast, well, in my case, they're definitely going to outlast me. Great memories of the 80s, pulling up for gas, filling up the tank, and paying for it with the change in your pocket. That ain't happening today. Another really neat thing about the 80s, and I think the 80s had a lot of things going for it. And look at this old truck buried in the flowers here. It's an old Mack truck. But thinking about the 80s and Westwood Suzuki, where I bought this bike and many, many other ones, Westwood Suzuki was a beautiful dealership. Hank and Barry, I know, treated everybody well. And there was a time when I went to their showroom and I saw this bike for the first time in real life. I sat on it and I started selling things so I could buy it. And I always think this bike is similar in some ways to the MT-09 that I have, in the fact that it does a lot of things well. It certainly is a comfortable bike. It certainly gets good mileage, up around 45. And it's certainly, you can plan a long trip on this and bolt things to the back of the seat and head out for a weekend of fun. You really can. Now the 80s are gone, but I'm so glad I have this bike and not much else to remind me of the 80s. Well, there are so many good memories of the 80s for me. The 80s were just a wonderful time to be alive. For people that are born after the 80s, you missed a good time. And when these were brand new and they were ruling the roost and drag racing and God almighty, the things, back in the 80s, everybody arguing about who could get into the 12s or the 11s or whatever. It was a great time to be alive, and this bike made it even more special. So I hope you did enjoy the video, and of course, guys, one and all, thank you so much for watching.